Today's scripture is from the book of Isaiah. A voice cries out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
I'm really honored to introduce today our guest preacher, who has become a friend of mine and someone who is speaking things that need to be spoken, and especially, not really sure he thought the pandemic was coming when he wrote all these great books about leadership and navigating uncharted territory, tempered resilience. But in our series here of a spiritual roadmap of resilience, it felt really appropriate not only to have Todd Bolsinger come and share the message today, but he'll be leading this afternoon and tomorrow some small focus groups of some of our leadership, talking about what it means to be the church in the world where we find ourselves. And I'm really excited about this time of discernment together, and I hope and pray that you'll be praying for that along as well for the next 2 days. Todd is married to Beth. They have 2 kids, Brooks and Allie. I believe that's right. I think I got it. Todd, the 2 books that have recently really spoken to me, we have some of them in our bookstore unless they got sold out really quick. One's Canoeing the Mountains, which has been really helpful for me in recent days, and it's about navigating uncharted territory. And then the Tempered Resilience, the most recent one, has been really good because it's about being formed as a leader in the crucible of change. That sounds like that really fits, right? Todd is a senior congregational strategist and also professor of leadership at Fuller Theological Seminary. And someday I'm going to unpack some of his pastoral appointments. He was at First Presbyterian in San Clemente for quite a number of years, 17, I think. But I really want to hear about his time as pastor of First Presbyterian in Hollywood. That's got to have great stories, right? Will you please welcome Todd Bolsinger as our guest preacher today?
Good morning. I was really hoping that the Astros were going to beat the Red Sox last night, so I at least would greet you at 3-0 instead of 2-1, but don't give up the faith. This morning, if the passage you heard already read this morning is a passage that many of us are really familiar with. You'll hear it around Christmas time. It's about John the Baptist, and it's incredibly relevant to today. It was spoken by the prophet Isaiah to the people of God when they were in a season of exile, when they literally had decades of despair, when they felt like the world couldn't change fast enough, and they wondered whether or not God was actually even hearing their prayers. Have you ever been in one of those moments when you feel like you have been praying for so long that you feel like you need just the whole earth to be rearranged for the sake of your family, your marriage, your business, your life, and you wonder where God is in the middle of that time of despair? Have you ever just felt like you were in the middle of one of those moments? The passage that we've read today is an incredibly important passage, and it was at another time when it was preached in front of 250,000 people who were in one of those moments. August 28th, 1963. 250,000 people came from all over the country to gather in front of the Lincoln Memorial. They came for what was called a march for freedom and jobs. They gathered, many of them in their Sunday best, coming from church buses, many of them having come from the South. This was in the heart of the civil rights movement, and many of these folks who had been on the front line of the civil rights movement, they personally had experienced the lunch counters and the marches and the protests and the dogs and the hoses and the jails. And they gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial to hear one speaker after another speak. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, sang 2 songs, and Roger Mudd said they all could have gone home after that. That was inspiring. And then a person stood up and introduced a man as the moral leader of our country, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who gave a speech that day that he'd worked on until 4 a.m. the night before with his speechwriter, Clarence B. Jones. They'd worked on a speech. It was really important to them that he used more of his academic brain and that he decided he wanted to do something that no one would ever accuse him of trying to incite any inflamed passions or any conflicts or riots or anything like that. No, it was a really sober argument. It was basically this. He said, the United States of America made a promise 100 years ago to its citizens, particularly its African American citizens. And it was like a promissory note that 100 years later has been left with insufficient funds. It was time for the United States to make good on its promises, the promises of the Emancipation Proclamation, the promises of the Declaration of Independence. It was time to make good on the promissory note. That was his speech. That was his speech that day. And he got to one of those moments that sometimes happens in the life of a preacher where you hit a point and you drop it there in the middle of the room, and he got no response. And he paused for just a second, wondering, what should he do at that moment? Every preacher's been there. And when he paused at that moment, he heard Mahalia Jackson behind him say, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." Mahalia Jackson had been with him around the country, particularly in Detroit, and she'd heard him do this thing that he did that's become known as the I Have a Dream section, one of the greatest pieces of oration in American history. And he hadn't planned to do it. And he slid his notes across the lectern. And Clarence B. Jones, who was sitting behind him, said to the person next to him, "These people don't know it, but they're about to go to church." And he launches into Isaiah 40, to the very passage that we heard this morning. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with, he says, to so many of these people who'd come from the South. Because of this faith, because I believe that a day is coming when God is going to redeem this world down to the dirt, we get back to work. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Do you hear that word? With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope. I can't hear that passage without thinking about 1 Peter, right? Come to him a living stone and let yourself as living stones be built into a dwelling place for God. What is he saying? With this faith, because we believe that God is going to someday make all the world right, God is going to come into this world and make it the way it's supposed to be. He's going to transform it down to the very smallest molecule, because we believe that. We get back to work because we believe that because with this faith, we'll be able to hew out of mountains of despair stones of hope, stones that will make the temple a place where God's own presence is seen right in the middle of the mountain of despair. Let me ask you, with whatever you're facing this moment, whatever you are facing in your business, in your family, in your kids' lives, your grandkids' lives, your own life, that just feels like it is this mountain of despair, this thing that is immovable, that you have tried to pray against and work against and strive against, that you're just standing there in front of this thing and you are ready to give up at this moment, and you find yourself, what do you do when you are facing a mountain of despair? You hew it. You transform it. For those of us who preach, this is a master class. This is called parallelism. It's where you take two ideas and you weave them together to get even a more poetic, more powerful notion. What do you do when you face a mountain of despair? You don't blow it up with dynamite. You don't bash it with a sledgehammer, and you don't back down. You hew it. You transform it. This mountain of despair becomes the stuff that you will use in your own life to reveal God's presence to the world. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope. So here's the question. Where do you find the resilience to face down the mountain of despair? Where do you find the resilience to face down the resistance in your life and in other lives around you? Where do you find the resilience to face that mountain of despair? Where do you find it? You don't. It's not found, it's formed. Resilience is part of a formation process. We're formed into tools that can hew. You know what a tool that can hew is? It's not a sledgehammer, it's a tempered tool. It's like a chisel. It's something that is stronger than the raw material and also more flexible. And a tempered, resilient person is someone who is both tougher and wiser. That has the capacity to face the thing that is in front of them and to transform it at this moment. It's a process that happens right in the middle of the very crucible that is causing us to despair in the first place. How do you become a tool that can hew? A tempered tool. I wanted to explore this, so I took a blacksmithing class. I'm from Los Angeles, and there's a blacksmithing community in Los Angeles. It's in a neighborhood. They haven't had a horse there in 100 years. But they got blacksmithing people there, and they'll teach you how to blacksmith, and you can sign up for the class, and I did. And I showed up in my jeans and a t-shirt and ready to take on this blacksmithing class. And you walk into this place, and every single thing in this building can kill you. And they tell you that. They hand you a clipboard and they make you sign on your name on a release that says you understand that this is a serious work and that every single thing in this room can kill you. And before you have done anything, they hand you earplugs. Earplugs, that's it. I thought I was going to get chain mail, big leather gloves, a helmet or something, right? I'm going to be dealing with steel and fire and stuff. No, earplugs. And wearing just a cotton t-shirt, my jeans, and some earplugs, they hand me a pair of tongs and a piece of steel, and I put the steel into the forge. It's going at 2,000 degrees. It's just throwing off heat. And I put the steel in there, and I'm blacksmithing. They haven't even given me a proper safety lecture yet, and I'm in the middle of this thing. And isn't this the way it is in life all the time? Every single thing that you're facing that's overwhelming, that feels like you were thrown into it before you knew exactly what you were doing. Your marriage, they hand you a baby. You're a parent. You're a new company. I thought this was a really good idea. I wanted to be CEO. What a dumb idea that was. Now I'm in charge of that. You took a promotion. You got a new job. You got kids. You got grandkids. Oh my gosh. I'm in it and I'm far into it before I could possibly prepared for it. This is really particularly true for those of us who are leaders. I work in leadership development, and here's one of the things I have to tell them all the time. Leaders are formed in the leading. You don't become a leader by reading a book or taking a class or going through a workshop, says the guy who wrote books, teaches classes, and leads workshops. You become a leader because you're in the middle of leading. And right in the middle of this thing, you've got to be transformed for the people who are counting on you. I always say this, and the moment you become a leader is right after the moment you were a success at something else that wasn't leading. You were a really good salesperson, so they made you the sales manager. You were really, really good. You're a really good teacher, and so they make you the dean. Actually, even worse than that. At our school, we got an amazing dean. He's a remarkable human being, and it is overwhelming to me to realize he prepared for this experience by being an incredible scholar. He has a 20-page CV. That means his resume is 20 pages. Each single line on the page is a book chapter or a book or an article he wrote. He spent the last decades in a complete climate-controlled, resource-rich, temperature-controlled environment called a library, where he was allowed to be left alone to do nothing but produce scholarship. He just works by himself, and he's genius, and he puts out these little ideas, kind of like the smoke that comes out of the Vatican when they pick a pope. Just boop, there it is. It's just brilliance out into the world. And they put him in charge of a faculty. Like, what good idea is that? And all of us have experienced this. We find ourselves, we're successful at something, and they come to you and they say, you're a really good preacher. You're good with 3 points in a poem. We'll put you in charge of a whole congregation. And we find ourselves in this over and over and over again. But leaders are formed in the leading. And resilience is formed in the crucible. When we're in the middle of the experience is where we find ourselves being transformed by the experience. It's in the middle of the protest, in the middle of the crisis, in the middle of the mountain of despair that we can become the tool that can hew. So what is that formation process? This is what I learned by taking a blacksmithing class. It's a process. It's a repetitive process. You have to do it over and over and over again. You don't just do it one time and done. You're in a long, repetitive process of heating and holding and hammering and quenching. Of heating and holding and hammering and quenching. Of heating and holding and hammering and quenching. Heating. What's the heat that transforms us? My dad, who was an old football coach, used to say, if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. What he meant to say is leaders got to be ready for things to get hot around them. And it's true, it does. What I want to say to leaders is if you want to become a really resilient leader, a tempered resilient leader, a wise and strong and capable leader who's able to transform despair into hope, the kitchen isn't hot enough. You got to go into the fire. When I was sitting there taking the blacksmithing class, we put the steel into the fire, and after a while, we're just sitting there. They did give us a proper safety lecture at that moment, and while the guy's lecturing, the thing's heating up. And finally, he goes, okay, stop for a second. Reach in with the tongs and pull out the steel. Just pull it out. I want you to notice, it looks exactly the same as it did 5 minutes ago. It is the same temperature. It looks the same. It would have the same kind of composition. Don't touch it. It's 700 degrees. It will burn the skin off your hands. But you can't do anything with this. It's just hot. It's just dangerous. It's 700 degrees. It's not ready to be shaped or formed till it gets to 1,200 degrees. Sometimes it's got to get to 2,000 degrees. The problem with so many of us as leaders is we have enough experience. We've been through enough things. We've felt enough heat that we are dangerous. We don't become people who can be transformed until we allow ourselves to be shaped, to be molded. And here's the great irony. You get strong by letting yourself first become soft, vulnerable, open, honest. The heat for most leaders that they want to avoid is the heat of vulnerable self-reflection, of being able to look at ourselves deeply in the mirror, to be able to come before God and say to God at this moment, when you think what you need to do is be strong, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is in the middle of all of this any hurtful way in me, any proud or arrogant, defensive way in me. It's hard to be vulnerable. It's really hard to feel vulnerable. You feel oozy. It feels like you feel like that steel that's now like 1,200 degrees that's sitting there kind of bubbly, where the molecules feel like they're falling apart, where you hold it up and gravity will make it bend over. And you think, this can't do anything. And at this moment, it feels as you just feel nothing but your own depression, your despair, your disappointment, your doubt. And it's actually at this moment when you are honest before God that you might be open for the very first time to the shaping that God wants to do in your life through this moment. And it feels vulnerable. It feels oozy. This is the heat that we need to be willing to take on. This is the heat that so many leaders won't take on. This is the moment that we push away, where we are so afraid of being seen and vulnerable that we won't even be honest before God or before loved ones in a way that could actually find shaping and forming and transforming. We're sitting in the middle of the blacksmithing class, and finally we put it back, the steel back into the fire, and finally he says, it's probably time to take it out now. So we reach in, and sure enough, it's 1,200 degrees, and it's just sitting there. It looks almost liquid, and it's radiant, and you're looking at it, and he goes, now don't carry it around the shop, don't twist it into shape, and don't hit it with a hammer. It'll explode. Put it on an anvil. The only safe place for something this hot is on an anvil. You see, for us to be transformed into people who are going to have resilience, you not only have to have the heat of vulnerable self-reflection, but you have to have the security of heavy, thick relationships. The center of the experience of blacksmithing is your anvil. They gave me an anvil. They let me put my name on the anvil. They reminded me that, yes, I had this forge, but the work is done here. And in our lives, if we want to become people who are resilient, who can be part of transforming this mountain of despair into a place where God's presence can be seen, we need an anvil. We need a thick, heavy anvil. And the anvil of our lives is our relationships. And here's the thing most of us need to recognize. As we get older, our anvil gets smaller. As we move up into places of authority, our relationships get weaker. Most of us struggle because we feel so deeply alone, like there's no one that we can rest ourselves on. And if you find yourself in a moment, especially if you're in a moment of leadership, a moment of needing to be transformed or transform others, you need the thickest, heaviest anvil you possibly can. Let me put it to you this way. I believe that everybody, if they're going to be transformed in the way God wants us to be transformed, need an anvil that's made up of partners, mentors, and friends. Partners, mentors, and friends. Your partners are the people who care more about the mission that God has given you than they care about you. My partners are the people who, if I didn't continue the work, they'd continue it on without me. They love me and they care about me. I got good partners, but my partners are more committed to the mission than they are to me. My friends are the people who care about me more than they care about the mission. My friends are the people who say, Todd, we're so happy about what you're doing, traveling around the country, working with folks and stuff, but are you okay? Are you doing okay? Do you want to go fishing? Do you want to get some time? Do you want to go to lunch? I mean, we love you, but we care more about you even now, this moment. My friends are the people who will say to me, Todd, hey, congratulations, we heard you got a new book out. And I'll go, yeah, would you like to read it? And they go, no, not interested in that at all. That's for those other folks. But how are you doing? You see, let's be really clear. This is where so much dysfunction happens really in churches. Your partners are people who are committed to the mission even more than they are about to you. Your friends are the people who care about you even more than the mission. And the big dysfunction that often happens in churches is people put their friends as partners. You put your friends on the board so that they'll be loyal to you, and that's when things go badly. You need partners and you need friends. And you need not to confuse the two, but you also need mentors. My partners are the people who care about the mission more than they care about me. My friends are the people who care about me more than they care about the mission. My mentors are the people who care about me for the sake of the mission. My mentors are the people who pray for me and counsel me and speak the truth to me and listen to me and care for me so that I'm not only the healthiest person I can be, but so that God can work through me in a way that's bigger than me. My mentors are the people who are deeply committed to me, but they're deeply committed to what will God do through me. I have mentors who are praying for me this morning that I will be effective for you. Your mentors are people like your therapists, your spiritual directors, your coaches. And here's the thing that I just want you to know. I just really believe that all of us need them all the time. That you're never in a place in your life than you could ever be without somebody who cares about you so that you can accomplish what God wants to do in and through your life. I sometimes joke about this. I'm a Presbyterian, we don't have bishops and all, but I spend a lot of my time with Methodists these days. And I one time joked in a room full of people, including a Methodist bishop, and I said, every now and then I have like these bishop fantasies where I can just basically say some stuff and people would listen to me. And then the bishops roll their eyes and say, I'm a Presbyterian, you don't know what you're saying. But I always say this, if I was your bishop, here's what I'd want you to know. If I'm your bishop, I'd want you to know that if you are leading anything, and you don't have a therapist, a spiritual director, or a coach, I'm going to consider that leadership malpractice. You see, I didn't make that up. My wife actually told me about this. She was a marriage and family therapist who was working in California, and she was part of our presbytery's sexual misconduct task force. So when pastors committed sexual misconduct, she's the one who had to go meet with parishioners about what it did to their lives spiritually. She came back one day and she looked at me and she said, I don't understand you religious types, you pastors, you. says, I got 15 clients and the state of California expects me to have supervision. If I don't, they will hold me liable. You got 1,500 members and nobody ever has to ask you anything. You see, it is dangerous for us to feel the vulnerability of leadership that we're going to feel if we're going to be transformed and not have a heavy anvil of relationships. Heating, holding, hammering, quenching. You know what the hammers are that shape us? The hammers aren't just the banging of leadership. The hammers that shape us into the tool that can be used are our spiritual practices. They're the practices where we allow God to shape us and form us. And the question for most of us as we think about going through these seasons of despair, these mountains in front of us, are our spiritual practices shaping us into the people who have the qualities we need for this moment? Are our spiritual practices actually helping us develop the humility, the ability to listen, the ability to be courageous? And spiritual practices are the things we do every single day in order to shape us. When I first became a Christian, the big challenge of my life was to know Jesus and follow Jesus. And so the people who called me into that said to you, you need to have some spiritual practices so that you can be more like Jesus. So I started going to church every week, praying every day, reading my Bible every day. But when I became a preacher, I needed to do more than read my Bible every day. I needed the spiritual practice of deep scriptural study so that I was prepared to be able to preach the scriptures every week to my congregation. So what are the spiritual practices that you need in your life, that might need to change in your life as you are at this moment of facing this moment of despair? What are those practices? What are the qualities you need in your life? I still pray and I still read my Bible. I still go to church, but I also need practices that remind me that I need to be a better listener, a better learner, more courageous. What are the hammers in your life? Heating, holding, hammering, and quenching. Do you know how you make a tempered tool? You don't just pound away at it and throw it in the water and let it cool down. You do that, it actually what they call locks in the stress. What you actually have to do is a rhythm of heating, holding, hammering, and quenching, and heating, holding, hammering, and quenching, and heating, holding, hammering, and quenching. You need a rhythm of releasing stress in your life, a rhythm, a regular pattern. You can't expect that you're going to become a tempered tool, a flexible, wise tool, a person that can be used for transformation if all you're doing is putting yourself under stress all the time, as if you're saving it up for a sabbatical or a big vacation or when you retire. You have to have a rhythm of releasing stress, of rest. When I first became a pastor, I began to be in church every Sunday morning. And for 27 years, my wife and I'd get up in the morning and she'd come to church later. When I was at the church, we had a 9:45 service and she would come to the 11 o'clock service. The only problem is the 11 o'clock service started at 10:45. She was always late every week. And I would say to her, you're late every week to church. And she would say, leave me alone. I'm in charge of my own spiritual life. And do you really need me to be here to hear you talk one more time, giving announcements? Don't ever fight with a therapist. And I remember when I finally retired, I said, here's the good thing. We're going to get to go to church every week and sit and worship together. First time in our marriage. Only problem is that she always wanted to be late, and I was used to being early. So every single week we were having this tension. I'm like, look, we're going to be late. And she's like, we'll get there. It'll be fine. I would say, yeah, but I think it's kind of rude. I think we need to be there early. I've been used to being there really early. She's used to wandering a few minutes late. Finally, one day we're going to church and she can feel me in the car just seething. And finally, she pulls up in front of the church. She opens the door and says, you get out, find us a seat. We're going to talk about this later. I said, oh yeah, we're going to talk about this later. Yeah, we need to. And I go into the sanctuary, we're starting to worship, and I'm just spewing. I'm just spinning. I'm like, I'm so tired of us being late. This is rude. This is wrong. I'm going to have to say something to her. She steps over some people who are particularly fine. Just find yourself. I'm so sorry. She's always late. And I'm thinking, okay, this is it. We're going to talk about this after church. And I felt like God said to me at this moment, they don't need you to be on time. You're actually not in charge here. They're perfectly fine without you. And I'm giving you this gift to sit next to your wife, and you're mad that you're a few minutes late. why don't you relax, let it go, and enjoy this gift that I want to give you? So now my spiritual practice is being late to church every week. Because I need to be reminded that I'm not in charge everywhere. That I need places where I can just trust other people. Heeding, holding, hammering, hewing. It's a process of formation that happens right in the middle of leading. Right in the middle of facing the mountain of despair. You know, for most of us, what we mostly need at those moments when we're facing that mountain of despair, what psychologists will tell us and what the leadership literature will tell us and what the scriptures tell us over and over again is, in order to be able to stay faithful to that moment, you need to be grounded in something other than your need to succeed at that moment. You need to be grounded in something other than needing to prove yourself, to make it happen, to bring the change. The change may not happen, and you need to be grounded in something that is bigger than your need to be successful at this moment. You need to be grounded in something bigger than you. For Dr. King, it was being grounded in the reality that whether he lived or whether he died, a day was going to come when God was going to renew this world down to the dirt so he could go back to work. For Jesus, it was being grounded in this reality. Before he did anything, before he preached a sermon, before he cast out a demon, before he confronted a power, before he healed anybody, before he did anything, there was a voice that met him with the Spirit of God in the baptism in the Jordan that said, "You are my beloved child. In you I am well pleased." When was God pleased with him? Before he'd done anything. Dear friends, if you're facing a mountain despair today, and you need the resilience to continue on, to go back to work, to allow God to shape you and form you to become a tool that can transform that despair into stones of hope where the presence of God will be revealed. Begin here. You are God's beloved child. Before you've done anything, he is already well pleased with you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.